Jack Dawson stepped out of his old pickup truck and took a deep breath. The air smelled like fresh asphalt mixed with the faint aroma of fried food wafting from the nearby diner. It was late afternoon, and the sun hung low in the sky, casting long shadows across the parking lot. Jack had been driving for hours, heading back home after spending the weekend with his daughter Laura and her family. He loved visiting them, but the drive always left him feeling tired and hungry. The diner looked inviting enough. Its sign read, "Joe's Diner," in bold red letters, illuminated by flickering neon lights despite the bright daylight. An American. Flag fluttered lazily beside the entrance, adding a touch of nostalgia to the otherwise unremarkable building. Jack adjusted his baseball cap, smoothed down his plaid shirt, and walked toward the door. At 58 years old, he still carried himself with the same discipline and confidence he'd developed during his decades-long career as a soldier. Even though he'd retired years ago, those habits never faded. Inside, the diner was quiet, save for the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of dishes. The interior had that classic Americana vibe, red vinyl booths lining the walls, chrome-trimmed stools at the counter, and black and white checkered floors. A jukebox in the corner played a slow country tune, barely audible over the chatter. Jack scanned the room, noting the handful of patrons scattered around. Most seemed ordinary enough. A couple sharing fries in one booth, a truck driver sipping coffee at the counter, and a group of teenagers laughing near the window. He approached the counter and slid onto a stool. The surface was cool against his palms as he rested his elbows on it. Behind the counter stood a young woman, probably in her early 20s, wearing a pink uniform and a name tag that read Cindy. She was busy scrolling through her phone, occasionally glancing up to check on customers. Her blonde hair was tied back in a messy ponytail, and she chewed gum absent-mindedly while tapping away at the screen. "Hi," Jack said politely, trying to get her attention. When she didn't respond right away, he cleared his throat and tried again. "Excuse me." Cindy finally looked up, her expression neutral. "Yeah?" she asked, not bothering to put her phone down. "I'd like to order something," Jack replied, keeping his tone friendly. "Could I get the cheeseburger combo?" For a moment, Cindy just stared at him. Then, without warning, her demeanor shifted. She glanced at his clothes, the plaid shirt, the worn jeans, the scuffed boots, and something clicked in her mind. Maybe it was the way he carried himself or the slight hint of age lines around his eyes. Whatever it was, she suddenly frowned and snapped, "Sorry, we're not serving veterans today." Jack blinked, unsure if he'd heard her correctly. "What did you say?" "You heard me," Cindy said, her voice sharp now. "We don't serve veterans here, too much hassle." The words hit Jack like a punch to the gut. For a second, he couldn't speak. His mouth opened, then closed again as he processed what she'd just said. He wasn't wearing any military insignia or patches, nothing obvious to give away his background, but somehow, she knew. Or maybe she didn't. Maybe it was just a wild guess. Either way, the implication stung. Other customers nearby turned their heads, curious about the sudden tension. Some exchanged glances while others pretended not to notice. The truck driver at the counter raised an eyebrow but kept sipping his coffee. One of the teenagers whispered something to their friend, and they both giggled nervously. No one spoke. Up. Jack felt a surge of anger bubbling inside him, but he forced himself to stay calm. Losing his temper wouldn't help the situation. Instead, he leaned forward slightly, resting his forearms on the counter. "Listen," he began, his voice steady despite the storm brewing within. "I'm not asking for special treatment. I just want a meal, same as anyone else." Cindy shrugged, clearly uninterested in hearing him out. "Rules are rules," she said dismissively. "Can't do anything about it." Jack clenched his jaw, resisting the urge to argue further. What would be the point? This girl wasn't going to change her mind, and making a scene wouldn't solve anything. With a heavy sigh, he slid off the stool and turned to leave. As he reached the door, he paused and looked back at Cindy, who had already returned to her phone. "This isn't how we treat people who serve this country," he muttered under his breath. Then, without waiting for a response, he pushed open the door and stepped outside. The warm breeze greeted him as he walked back to his truck. He climbed inside and gripped the steering wheel tightly, trying to process what had just happened. In all his years, he'd never experienced anything like this. Sure, there were difficult moments after retiring. Adjusting to civilian life wasn't easy, but outright rejection because of his service? That was new. As he sat there, staring blankly at the horizon, a thought crossed his mind. Perhaps this was a sign of how far society had drifted. People often talked about supporting troops and honoring veterans, but actions rarely matched the rhetoric. Still, Jack refused to let bitterness take hold. He reminded himself of all the good people he'd met throughout his life, the ones who truly cared, who went out of their way to show gratitude. Those memories outweighed the bad, even on days like today. Little did Jack know, however, that someone inside the diner had witnessed the entire exchange. Steve, the truck driver sitting at the counter, watched as Jack left, his face etched with disappointment. Steve admired soldiers. His own father had served in Vietnam, and he grew up listening to stories of sacrifice and bravery. Seeing a veteran treated so poorly made his blood boil. Without hesitation, Steve pulled out his phone and opened a social media app. He typed out a quick post, describing what had happened and expressing his outrage. To make sure it gained traction, he tagged several veteran support groups and even mentioned Chuck Norris, whose name often came up in discussions about respecting veterans. Within minutes, the post started gaining attention. Comments poured in, ranging from shock to disbelief. Someone joked, "If only Chuck Norris were here." Another replied, "Maybe he will be." And somewhere in town, Chuck Norris saw the message. Steve wasn't sure why he felt so compelled to act. Maybe it was because he'd grown up hearing stories about his father's time in Vietnam, how hard it had been when he came home, how people didn't always understand what soldiers went through. Or maybe it was just the injustice of seeing someone like Jack Dawson treated so poorly. Whatever the reason, Steve couldn't sit there and do nothing. After typing out his post, Steve hit send and leaned back on his stool, watching. As notifications began popping up almost instantly, his phone buzzed repeatedly with likes, shares, and comments. Some people expressed outrage over the treatment of veterans, while others simply thanked him for speaking up. One commenter joked, "If only Chuck Norris were here, he'd straighten them out." Another replied, "Maybe he will be." The comment thread quickly spiraled into playful banter about Chuck Norris's legendary toughness and respect for veterans, but no one expected anything to actually come of it. After all, Chuck Norris was a busy man. He traveled the world for charity events, appeared on TV shows, and spent time with his family. What were the chances he'd see a random social media post about a diner incident? Unbeknownst to Steve and everyone else, Chuck Norris did see the post. At that very moment, Chuck was attending a charity event in the same town where Joe's diner was located. His assistant, Rachel, showed him the viral thread after noticing how quickly it had spread online. Chuck read through the comments silently, his jaw tightening as he processed the details. When he finished, he looked up at Rachel and said firmly, "We need to go." Rachel nodded without hesitation. She knew better than to question Chuck when he made up his mind. Within minutes, they gathered a small team, including Amanda, another close friend who often helped with veteran outreach efforts, and piled into 6 black SUVs parked outside the event venue. Each vehicle carried members of Chuck's security detail, along with supplies and equipment they might need if things got complicated. As the convoy sped toward the diner, Chuck sat quietly in the passenger seat of the lead SUV. His thoughts focused on the veteran named Jack Dawson. He didn't know much about Jack beyond what he'd read online, but he didn't need to. Veterans were family, plain and simple. They deserved respect, not rejection. And if this diner thought they could get away with treating a soldier that way, they were about to learn otherwise. Back at Joe's diner, Cindy hadn't given much thought to the veteran she'd turned away earlier. As far as she was concerned, the matter was closed. She continued scrolling through her phone, occasionally refilling drinks or dropping off plates for customers. The atmosphere inside the diner remained tense, though most patrons avoided discussing the incident openly. Some whispered among themselves, wondering if the veteran would return or if anyone else would speak up. Others tried to ignore the tension, altogether focusing instead on their meals. Meanwhile, Steve kept checking his phone, amazed by how quickly his post had gained traction. It wasn't every day that something you shared online went viral, especially within such a short amount of time. He glanced out the window absently, half expecting to see nothing unusual. So when 6 black SUVs rolled into the parking lot, his jaw dropped. "What the?" Steve muttered under his breath, leaning closer to the glass for a better view. Sure enough, the vehicles came to a stop right outside the diner, and moments later, Chuck Norris stepped out of the first car. Steve blinked, convinced he was imagining things. But no, it really was Chuck Norris, complete with his iconic cowboy hat and aviator sunglasses. Behind him, several men and women emerged from the other SUVs, forming a loose semicircle around Chuck as they approached the entrance. Inside the diner, the arrival of the convoy caused an immediate stir. Customers craned their necks to see what was happening, and even Cindy finally put down her phone to investigate. When she saw Chuck walking toward her, her face went pale. She recognized him instantly. The chiseled jawline, the confident stride, the unmistakable aura of authority. Suddenly, her earlier bravado vanished, replaced by sheer panic. Chuck entered the diner calmly, removing his sunglasses as he moved. Every eye in the room followed him, including those of the staff behind the counter. The noise level dropped significantly, leaving only the faint hum of the jukebox playing in the background. Cindy froze, unsure whether to run or hide. Instead, she stood rooted to the spot, clutching a tray like it was a lifeline. "Which one? Have you turned away the veteran?" Chuck asked, his voice firm but controlled. There was no anger in his tone, just a quiet determination that demanded answers. Cindy swallowed hard, her hands trembling slightly. I did," she stammered, barely audible over the silence. Chuck nodded slowly, fixing her with a piercing gaze. "Why? I don't know," Cindy faltered, tears welling up in her eyes. "It was stupid, I wasn't thinking." "That's right," Chuck said, his voice rising just enough to command attention. "You weren't thinking, because if you had been, you'd remember that veterans like Jack Dawson sacrificed years of their lives so you could stand here today. They deserve better than disrespect." The words hung in the air, heavy and undeniable. Other customers exchanged guilty glances, some nodding in agreement. Even the teenagers near the window stopped giggling, realizing the gravity of the situation. For the first time since the incident began, the room felt united, not divided. Chuck turned to address the crowd directly. "Does anyone know where Jack went?" he asked, scanning the faces around him. Steve raised his hand hesitantly. "I think I can help with that," he offered, standing up from his stool. He mentioned visiting his daughter nearby before this happened. "Good," Chuck replied, gesturing for Steve to join him. Together they stepped outside, where Rachel and Amanda were already coordinating efforts to locate Jack. Using information Steve provided, they quickly found Laura's address and prepared to head there next. Before leaving, Chuck paused briefly to speak with the diner owner, who had emerged from the kitchen upon hearing the commotion. The owner, a middle-aged man named Joe, looked mortified by the entire ordeal. He apologized profusely, promising to make amends not only to Jack but also to all veterans moving forward. Chuck accepted the apology but warned, "Actions speak louder than words. Make sure this doesn't happen again." With that, the group climbed back into their vehicles and drove off, leaving behind a diner full of stunned customers and a waitress who now understood the weight of her mistake. The drive to Laura's house didn't take long. Steve gave clear directions and Rachel navigated using her phone while Chuck focused on what he would say when they arrived. He knew this wasn't just about making someone apologize. It was about restoring respect and dignity to a man who had earned it through years of service. Veterans like Jack Dawson deserved better than being turned away because of ignorance or indifference. When they pulled up to the address, Chuck immediately spotted the cozy suburban home with its white picket fence and neatly trimmed lawn. Looked like the kind of place where families gathered for barbecues and holidays, quiet, peaceful, and full of warmth. As he stepped out of the SUV, his boots crunched softly against the gravel driveway. Amanda and 2 other members of the team joined him, while the rest stayed by the vehicles to avoid overwhelming the situation. Chuck walked up to the front door and knocked firmly but not too loudly. Inside, Jack Dawson sat at the dining table with his daughter Laura and her 2 young children. They were finishing dinner, laughing over something silly one of the kids had said. When the knock came, Laura excused herself and headed to the door, curious about who might be visiting so late in the evening. She opened it cautiously, her smile fading into wide-eyed surprise as she recognized the man standing there. "Oh my goodness," she whispered, stepping aside instinctively. "Is that Chuck Norris?" Chuck tipped his cowboy hat politely. "Ma'am," he said with a slight nod. "I'm looking for your father, Jack Dawson. Is he here?" Laura nodded, still stunned. "Yes, he's inside. Please, come in." As Chuck entered the house, followed by Amanda and Steve, Jack looked up from the table, confusion written all over his face. For a moment he thought he was dreaming. Chuck Norris, here, in his daughter's living room. What could possibly bring someone like him to this quiet little corner of town? "Jack," Chuck began, extending a hand toward the retired soldier. "My name is Chuck Norris. I heard about what happened at the diner today." Jack stood slowly, shaking Chuck's hand. His grip was firm, though his voice wavered slightly. I don't know what to say. This is, unexpected." Chuck smiled warmly. "You don't have to say anything right now. Just listen. What happened to you today was wrong, plain and simple. No veteran should ever be treated that way. That's why we're here, to make sure you get the respect you deserve." Tears welled up in Laura's eyes as she listened to Chuck speak. She'd always been proud of her father's service, but hearing these words from someone like Chuck made her chest swell with emotion. Even her children, too young to fully understand the gravity of the moment, seemed captivated by the presence of such a legendary figure. Steve chimed in, explaining how his social media post had gone viral and caught Chuck's attention. "It wasn't me," he insisted humbly. "People everywhere are outraged about what happened, but Chuck wanted to handle it personally." Jack shook his head, still processing everything. "I appreciate it more than I can put into words, but honestly, I didn't want any trouble. I figured it was just one bad experience and I'd move on." "That's exactly why we're here," Amanda added gently. "Because you shouldn't have to move on without justice. And because veterans, like you, inspire us every single day." Chuck turned back to Jack, his expression serious yet kind. "Would you mind coming with us? We'd like to go back to the diner together, if you're comfortable with that. The owner wants to apologize and the staff needs to see firsthand the impact of their actions." For a moment, Jack hesitated. Part of him wanted to let the whole thing drop and forget about it. After all, he'd dealt with worse during his time in the Army. But another part of him realized this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about setting an example. If people saw how important it was to treat veterans with respect, maybe incidents like this wouldn't happen again. Finally, Jack nodded. "All right," he said quietly. "Let's do it." Laura hugged her father tightly before he left, whispering, "Show them who you are, Dad." Her children waved goodbye, their faces lighting up as Chuck bent down to give them high fives. Then the group piled back into the SUVs and headed toward the diner. On the way, Chuck kept the conversation light, asking Jack about his life after retirement and sharing stories about his own experiences meeting veterans across the country. Jack found himself relaxing a bit, grateful for Chuck's easygoing nature despite the seriousness of the situation. By the time they reached the diner, he felt ready to face whatever awaited him. The parking lot buzzed with activity when they arrived. Word had spread quickly about Chuck Norris showing up earlier, and now a small crowd had gathered outside the diner. Some were locals curious about the commotion, while others held signs supporting veterans. A few reporters even showed up, cameras flashing as Chuck stepped out of the lead vehicle. Inside, the atmosphere was tense but expectant. Joe, the diner owner, stood nervously near the counter, wringing his hands. Cindy, the waitress, looked close to tears, her earlier defiance replaced by shame. Other staff members hovered nearby, unsure of what to do. Chuck led Jack inside, ensuring everyone saw the retired soldier walking proudly beside him. The room fell silent as they approached the counter. Joe cleared his throat and stepped forward, his voice trembling. "Mr. Dawson, I'm so sorry for what happened here today. It won't happen again, I promise." Jack met Joe's gaze steadily. "Thank you," he said simply. There was no anger in his tone, only a quiet strength that commanded respect. Cindy finally mustered the courage to speak. "I'm sorry too," she whispered, her voice barely audible. "I didn't mean to hurt anyone. I was wrong." Jack nodded slowly. "We all make mistakes," he replied. "What matters is learning from them." Chuck placed a reassuring hand on Jack's shoulder. "Now, let's turn this around," he said, addressing the entire diner. "How about we start with a proper meal? On the house, of course." Joe nodded eagerly, motioning for the cooks to prepare Jack's order immediately. Within minutes, the kitchen sprang to life, filling the air with the smell of sizzling burgers and fresh fries. Staff members worked together seamlessly, determined to make amends. As Jack took a seat at the counter, Chuck personally served him the cheeseburger combo he'd originally ordered. "This is how it should be," Chuck said with a smile. "Respect starts with action, not words." Applause erupted from the crowd, both inside and outside the diner. Strangers patted Jack on the back, thanking him for his service. Reporters snapped photos, capturing the moment for newspapers and social media feeds. For the first time in hours, Jack felt truly seen, not as a victim but as a hero. And as Chuck raised a glass of water in a silent toast to Jack, the message was clear. Respect for veterans wasn't negotiable. It was non-negotiable. As Chuck placed the plate of food in front of Jack, the entire diner erupted into applause. People stood from their booths and stools, some whistling, others shouting words of encouragement. The energy in the room shifted completely, from tension and awkwardness to warmth and celebration. Even Cindy, the waitress who had turned Jack away earlier, joined in, her face flushed with emotion as tears streamed down her cheeks. Jack looked around, stunned by the outpouring of kindness. He hadn't expected this kind of reaction. All he'd wanted was a quiet meal before heading home. But now he found himself at the center of what felt like a community awakening. For years, he'd heard stories about how society treated veterans, some positive, some negative. But tonight, he saw firsthand just how much respect could mean when it was given freely and sincerely. Chuck leaned closer to Jack and spoke softly, so only Jack could hear. "You deserve every bit of this," he said, his voice steady and reassuring. "Never forget that." Jack nodded, blinking back tears. "I don't know what to say," he admitted. "This is overwhelming." "You don't have to say anything," Chuck replied with a small smile. "Just enjoy your meal and let us take care of the rest." With that, Chuck stepped back slightly, giving Jack space to eat. But instead of leaving the scene entirely, he stayed nearby, chatting with the staff and customers, making sure everyone understood the importance of respecting veterans. His presence alone seemed to inspire people to open up about their own connections to military service. One older man shared that his brother had served in Korea, while a young woman talked about her cousin currently deployed overseas. Each story added another layer of meaning to the evening. Meanwhile, outside the diner, the crowd continued to grow. Locals who had heard about the incident on social media or through word of mouth came to show their support. Some held handmade signs that read, "Thank you, veterans," or "We stand with our heroes." Others simply stood quietly, watching, through the diner's large glass windows as the events unfolded inside. Reporters snapped photos and conducted brief interviews, capturing not just the drama of the situation but also the heartfelt moments of reconciliation. Back inside, Joe, the diner owner, was doing everything he could to make amends. After apologizing to Jack, he announced to the entire diner that starting next week, Joe's Diner would host a weekly Veteran Appreciation Day. Every Monday, all active-duty military personnel and veterans would receive free meals as a token of gratitude. The announcement earned another round of applause, and several customers immediately pledged to spread the word. Cindy, still visibly shaken, approached Jack cautiously after things settled down a bit. She held a napkin in her hands, twisting it nervously as she spoke. "Mr. Dawson," she began, her voice trembling, "I want to apologize again. I was wrong, not just because of what I said, but because I didn't stop to think about what you've done for people like me. I'm so sorry." Jack looked at her for a long moment, then gestured for her to sit beside him. To everyone's surprise, he smiled gently. "Apology accepted," he said. "We all make mistakes. What matters is learning from them. And if you ever need someone to talk to about veterans or what we go through, I'm here." Cindy nodded, relief washing over her face. "Thank you," she whispered. "That means more than you know." The interaction didn't go unnoticed. Chuck watched silently from a distance, nodding approvingly. This was exactly the kind of outcome he'd hoped for. Not just an apology, but a chance for growth and understanding. It wasn't enough to simply fix one mistake. The goal was to create lasting change. As the night wore on, the mood remained celebratory. Strangers introduced themselves to Jack, sharing stories and shaking his hand. Children asked Chuck for autographs, which he happily signed with a smile. Amanda and Rachel worked behind the scenes, organizing donations from local businesses to support veteran charities in the area. By the time the clock struck 9, the diner felt less like a restaurant and more like a community hub, a place where people came together to honor those who had sacrificed so much. Eventually, Chuck pulled Jack aside for a private conversation. They stepped out onto the sidewalk where the cool evening air provided a refreshing contrast to the warmth of the diner. The crowd outside cheered once more as they appeared, but Chuck raised a hand to quiet them. "Jack," he said, turning to face the retired soldier, "this isn't the end of the road for you. You've got a platform now, whether you realize it or not. People are inspired by what happened here tonight. They want to do better. For you, for other veterans, and for themselves." Jack frowned slightly, unsure of what Chuck meant. "What do you mean? I'm just an ordinary guy." Chuck chuckled softly. "There's no such thing as ordinary when it comes to veterans. Look around you. These people aren't here because of me. They're here because of you. Because of the life you've lived and the values you represent. Now it's time to use that influence to help others." For a moment, Jack didn't respond. He glanced at the crowd, at the reporters jotting notes, at the families holding signs of gratitude. Then he looked back at Chuck, his expression thoughtful. "How do I even start?" he asked. "We'll figure it out together," Chuck replied confidently. "Rachel and Amanda have already reached out to some veteran organizations. If you're willing, we can work on expanding outreach programs, raising awareness, and finding ways to support veterans who might not have the resources they need." Jack considered the idea carefully. He'd always cared deeply about helping fellow veterans, but he'd never imagined taking on such a visible role. Still, the thought of making a difference, even in a small way, was appealing. And with someone like Chuck Norris backing him, he knew he wouldn't be alone. Finally, Jack nodded. "All right," he said firmly. "Let's do it." Chuck grinned, slapping him lightly on the shoulder. "That's the spirit. We'll get started tomorrow. Tonight, though, you should focus on enjoying this moment. You've earned it." With that, they returned to the diner, where the celebration showed no signs of slowing down. Jack spent the next hour talking to strangers, posing for photos, and accepting heartfelt thanks from people of all ages. By the time he finally left, accompanied by Chuck and his team, the parking lot was nearly empty, but the impact of the evening lingered in the air. As Jack climbed into his truck to head home, he couldn't help but feel a renewed sense of purpose. What had started as a frustrating and humiliating experience had transformed into something extraordinary. Thanks to Chuck Norris and the power of community, Jack realized that respect wasn't just something to hope for, it was something to fight for, and fight for it he would. The days following the diner incident passed quickly, but the impact of that night continued to ripple through the town and beyond. News outlets picked up the story, turning it into a national conversation about honoring veterans. Social media buzzed with hashtags like "Respect Our Heroes" and "Thank You Veterans," as people shared their own stories of military service and sacrifice. The image of Chuck Norris personally serving Jack Dawson at the counter went viral, symbolizing not just an act of kindness but a call to action for communities everywhere. For Jack, life changed in ways he never anticipated. Overnight, he became a local celebrity, not because he sought attention, but because people saw him as a symbol of resilience and humility. Strangers stopped him on the street to thank him for his service, while local businesses offered discounts and free services to show their support. It was overwhelming at times, but Jack handled it with grace, always reminding himself that the focus shouldn't be on him. It should be on all veterans who deserved recognition. With Chuck's guidance, Jack began working closely with Rachel and Amanda to expand veteran outreach initiatives. They started by organizing meetings with local leaders, discussing ways to improve access to healthcare, housing, and job opportunities for retired soldiers. Jack brought first-hand knowledge of the challenges veterans faced, while Rachel and Amanda provided organizational expertise and connections to national networks. Together, they formed a team dedicated to making tangible changes. One of their first projects was transforming the diner's Veteran Appreciation Day into a broader community effort. Joe, the diner owner, eagerly joined forces, offering his establishment as a hub for monthly events where veterans could connect with resources and support groups. Other local businesses followed suit, donating goods, services, and funding to ensure the program's success. Within weeks, the initiative gained momentum, drawing participants from neighboring towns and even other states. But Jack and his team didn't stop there. Inspired by the groundswell of support, they decided to organize a large-scale event, a rally celebrating veterans' contributions to society. The goal was twofold: to honor those who had served and to raise awareness about ongoing issues affecting veteran communities. Chuck Norris agreed to headline the event, lending his name and influence to attract attention and attendance. Months later, the day of the rally arrived. Thousands of people gathered in a sprawling park on the outskirts of town, eager to participate in what promised to be a memorable occasion. Rows of folding chairs stretched across the field, though many attendees chose to stand or sit on blankets spread over the grass. Food trucks lined one side of the area, offering complimentary meals to veterans and their families. Booths staffed by volunteers provided information about mental health counseling, educational scholarships, and employment assistance programs, specifically designed for former service members. On stage, Jack stood nervously beside Chuck Norris, adjusting the microphone as he prepared to address the crowd. Despite his growing confidence over the past few months, public speaking still made him uneasy. But as he looked out at the sea of faces, some familiar, most not, he felt a surge of determination. These were the people who had rallied behind him, who believed in the cause he represented. He owed it to them, and to every veteran, to speak from the heart. "Good afternoon," Jack began, his voice steady despite the butterflies in his stomach. "I want to start by saying thank you to each and every one of you for being here today. This isn't just a rally, it's a movement to remind ourselves that freedom isn't free. It comes at a cost, paid by men and women who put everything on the line for our country." The crowd erupted into applause, cheering loudly. Jack paused, letting the moment sink in before continuing. "When I walked into that diner months ago, I wasn't looking for anything special, just a meal and a moment of peace. What I got instead was a lesson in how far we've come and how much farther we have to go. That night, thanks to Chuck Norris and so many others, I learned that respect isn't something we wait for. It's something we demand, and something we give." He gestured toward Chuck, who tipped his cowboy hat in acknowledgement. "Chuck reminded me that no veteran should ever feel invisible, and neither should their struggles. Whether it's finding a job, accessing health care, or simply feeling valued, we owe it to these heroes to step up and make a difference." Jack's words resonated deeply with the audience. Many nodded in agreement, while others wiped away tears. When he finished speaking, the applause was thunderous, lasting several minutes before Chuck took the stage to add his perspective. "Jack Dawson is living proof that one person can spark change," Chuck said, his voice commanding yet compassionate. But this isn't about one person, it's about all of us. We're here today because we believe in a better future for those who've given so much. So let's keep fighting, not just for veterans, but for everyone who deserves respect and dignity. As the speeches concluded, the rally transitioned into a celebration. Live music played, children ran around laughing, and veterans mingled with civilians, sharing stories and forging connections. For many, it was the first time they'd felt truly seen and appreciated in years. Later that evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Jack stood off to the side of the stage, watching the festivities wind down. Chuck joined him, placing a hand on his shoulder. "You did good today, Jack," he said warmly. "This is just the beginning." Jack smiled, feeling a mix of pride and purpose. "I couldn't have done it without you, or without everyone else who pitched in. This isn't my victory, it's ours." Chuck nodded approvingly. "Exactly. And remember, the real work happens after the cameras leave. Keep pushing forward, keep inspiring people, because when we stand together, there's nothing we can't accomplish." With those words, Jack knew he was ready for whatever came next. The journey ahead wouldn't be easy, but he wasn't alone. Together with Chuck, Rachel, Amanda, and countless others, he was building a legacy of respect, one that would endure long after the rally ended. In the weeks and months after the rally, life began to settle into a new rhythm, but it was a rhythm filled with purpose. Joe's Diner became more than just a place to grab a bite to eat. It transformed into a sanctuary for veterans and their families. The diner's walls were adorned with photos of soldiers, both past and present, including several pictures from the rally. One prominent frame showed Jack Dawson standing beside Chuck Norris, their arms raised in victory as the crowd cheered behind them. Beneath the photo, a plaque read, "This is what respect looks like." Cindy, the waitress who had once turned Jack away, worked tirelessly to make amends. She took it upon herself to learn about veterans' experiences, reading books, attending workshops, and even volunteering at local veteran support centers. Her transformation didn't go unnoticed. Customers often commented on how kind and attentive she had become, especially when serving veterans. Cindy no longer saw her job as just a paycheck. It was a chance to give back. Joe, the diner owner, kept his promise to honor veterans every Monday. What started as a simple gesture grew into something much bigger. Other businesses in town joined the initiative, offering discounts or free services to veterans on Appreciation Mondays. Barbershops gave free haircuts, gyms offered complimentary memberships, and grocery stores provided essential items at reduced prices. Slowly but surely, the entire community rallied around the cause, proving that change could happen when people came together. For Jack, the impact of the movement extended far beyond his hometown. Thanks to media coverage and social media shares, similar programs sprang up across the country. Veterans in other states reached out to Jack asking for advice on how to start their own initiatives. With help from Rachel, Amanda, and Chuck, Jack traveled to different cities, speaking at events and meeting with local leaders to share his story and inspire action. One of the most rewarding aspects of Jack's journey was reconnecting with old friends from his military days. Many of them had struggled silently for years, unsure of where to turn for help. Hearing about Jack's efforts gave them hope and courage to seek support. Some even joined him on the road, sharing their own stories and lending their voices to the cause. Together, they formed a network of advocates determined to break down barriers and build bridges for veterans everywhere. Back home, the diner remained the heart of the movement. Every Monday, veterans gathered there not just for free meals but also for camaraderie and connection. It wasn't uncommon to see groups swapping war stories, laughing over shared memories, or simply enjoying each other's company. For many, the diner became a second home, a safe space where they felt seen, heard, and valued. Laura, Jack's daughter, played a key role in keeping the momentum going. As a school teacher, she incorporated lessons about veterans into her curriculum, teaching her students about sacrifice, service, and gratitude. Her classroom often hosted guest speakers, including Jack, who told stories of his time in the Army and answered questions from curious kids. By educating the younger generation, Laura ensured that the spirit of appreciation would carry forward. Even Cindy found a way to contribute beyond her work at the diner. After resigning from her position to focus on personal growth, she enrolled in a community service program aimed at helping struggling veterans reintegrate into civilian life. Through the program, she learned valuable skills and gained a deeper understanding of the challenges veterans faced. Eventually, she returned to the diner part-time, bringing with her a renewed sense of purpose and compassion. As time went on, the diner itself underwent subtle changes. New menu items were added, named after famous veterans or inspired by military traditions. The staff wore uniforms featuring patches that read, "Proud to serve those who served," and a donation jar sat on the counter raising funds for veteran charities. Even the jukebox playlist was updated to include songs written by or about soldiers. The ripple effect of that single moment, the day Jack was refused service, continued to spread. People who had never thought twice about veterans before now made an effort to thank them whenever possible. Strangers approached soldiers in airports, restaurants, and parks, offering handshakes and hugs. Social media platforms buzzed with posts celebrating acts of kindness toward veterans, creating a culture of gratitude that transcended borders and generations. Chuck Norris stayed involved too, using his platform to amplify the message. He appeared on talk shows, wrote articles, and partnered with organizations dedicated to supporting veterans. Whenever he spoke, he credited Jack for inspiring him to take action. "Jack reminded me that heroes aren't defined by their titles or accomplishments," Chuck often said. "They're defined by their character and by the difference they make in the lives of others." For Jack, the greatest reward wasn't fame or recognition. It was knowing that he'd helped create lasting change. He still woke up early every morning, put on his boots, and tackled the day with the same determination he'd shown during his Army days. But now, instead of fighting battles overseas, he fought for justice and dignity on behalf of those who had served. On one particularly sunny afternoon, Jack returned to the diner for lunch. The place was bustling as usual, filled with laughter and conversation. As he slid onto a stool at the counter, Cindy greeted him with a bright smile. "The usual, Mr. Dawson?" she asked, already reaching for the order slip. Jack chuckled and nodded. "You know me too well." While he waited for his meal, he glanced around the room, taking in the familiar sights and sounds. The framed photos on the wall caught his eye, and he felt a swell of pride. Each picture represented a step forward, a moment of progress in a world that sometimes forgot to say thank you. And yet, here they were, proof that humanity could rise above its flaws and choose kindness over indifference. When his food arrived, Jack paused before digging in. He looked at Cindy, then at the other patrons, and finally at the American flag hanging proudly near the entrance. "This is what we fought for," he murmured to himself. "Not perfection, but unity. Not agreement, but respect." And with that, he picked up his fork and enjoyed his meal, surrounded by a community that had learned to honor its heroes, not just in words, but in actions.